Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I'm going to talk about villains and why villains in current stories are often portrayed as if they were heroes. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that there are 2 links in the description and in the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. If you want stories about true traditional heroes, there are my 2 superhero graphic novels available at the Valiant Heroes Indiegogo site and my Sword and Sorcery Return to Low Fantasy at Crom the Destroyer. All of my stories are focused around the idea of a traditional hero and the expression of that in various ways, accompanied by some very spectacular and clean art, which you're looking at in the background. So if any of that sounds appealing to you at all, then click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go over and see if one of my graphic novels are for you. But back to my topic. So recently, just this past week, I was doing a live stream where I started to talk about the traditional role of a hero, and it brought to mind a scene from Indiana Jones. And while discussing that scene and thinking about it more afterwards, it helped clarify for me the difference between what a villain used to look like 20, 30 years ago and what the current batch of villains within the last 20, certainly within the last 15 and 10 years look like now, because there has been a massive shift in how villains are portrayed. And that scene from Indiana Jones was the one where Indiana Jones is talking to Belosh, or Belloc, depending on what language you use to express his name. And Belloc says, "You and I are very much alike. Archaeology is our religion, yet we have both fallen from the pure of faith. Our methods have not differed as much as you pretend. I am but a shadowy reflection of you. It would take only a nudge to make you like me, to push you out of the light." And Indiana Jones replies, "Now you're getting nasty." And the reason why this scene strikes such a chord is because it has been repeated over and over and over again in many different stories, where the hero gets confronted by the villain and the villain says, "You're just like me." And the hero says, "No, I'm not." And the reason why this has changed for villains over the last 10 to 20 years is because the writers have started to believe that exact thing which the villains have always expressed, that those villains, even though they are labeled villains, are nothing more than heroes of their own story. And all you have to do is walk a mile in their shoes to see that they might be a hero. But this is absolutely contrary to the expression of this kind of scene within story after story in older types of media. And the question becomes, why, first of all, is this such an important scene in older stories, and why this change has been made, and what this change means? So to tackle the first question, why is this scene so important in older stories? Well, because it sets up the very fundamental difference between the hero and the villain. And that fundamental difference is the result of the choices of each of these individuals. When the story portrays this encounter in older expressions of it, it is to present both the dark and the light to the audience and say that this person is a hero because they made the right choices, and this person is a villain because they made the wrong choices. It is to set up for the audience a very quick understanding of how the choices of each individual led them to where they are and who they are. And the expression of a true traditional hero within Western civilization, which is a paragon of virtue, which is to say they chose the right path, as opposed to a villain, which is a paragon of vice, which is to say they have chosen the wrong path, the vicious path. Because free will and free choice has been at the center of the difference between a hero and a villain for millennia, within certainly Western civilization and its stories. And to bring in another popular culture reference to show this kind of scene in a different way and what exactly will has to do with it, all we have to do is look at a couple of scenes from Star Wars. In the original Star Wars, the first film, when the dark and the light confront each other, which is the battle between Luke and Darth Vader, Vader cuts off Luke's hand and says, "Join me." And Luke's reply to that is, "I'll never join you," which is to say, I will never join you. Will in that sentence is supremely important. It is his choice that he will sacrifice himself, throw himself off of that antenna, rather than join what is evil. And two important things to note about that scene is, number one, Vader says in part of the conversation, in trying to convince Luke to join him, is search your feeling. And another is when he says, there's no other choice. And yet, Luke finds a different choice. He sacrifices himself, or does something which he believes will sacrifice himself. So again, he wills to choose something other than the darkness. This is the confrontation within the first movie, and this is bookended by the confrontation in Return of the Jedi, where Luke meets the Emperor, and he says almost the exact same thing. I'll never join the dark side. Even though there is an arc to this hero, this constantly stays the same. So this moment of confrontation between darkness and light, between goodness and evil, between virtue and vice, is where the light overcomes the darkness through the extension of a free choice. Now, why is this idea of a free choice so supremely important? Well, let's go back to a very old story and answer that question. But before we get there, I'll just have to note that when you look at the idea of free will and free choice, the idea as expressed within Western civilization drastically changed in the extent of how it was expressed or thought to be expressed within individuals within circa 400 AD by Augustine of Hippo. He took the idea of free will and redefined it for all of Western civilization, and it is the idea of free will that we still use today. He gave it a basis of Christian understanding at that time, because before that time, the idea of free will and free choice was distinctly Greek in its origins and its expression, both within the Greeks and the Romans, who were the controlling forces of most of that area. And to my mind, it always goes back to the expression of free will within the epic cycle. And that epic cycle, usually people think of the Iliad as the only expression of it, but it isn't really the only expression. There are various forms of telling this story if you want to delve into a whole lot of Greek storytelling. But one important scene within that epic cycle is the death of Aias, also known in the Latin as Ajax. Because here's the thing, for the Greeks, the idea of free will was there, but it was reserved for the epic. It was reserved for the heroic. It was reserved for the divine. Because there were many different forces within the Greek way of thinking that would control a person's life. Fate, destiny, and yes, they were two different things. There were also other ideas, some which we have no translation for, like ate or ate, depending on how different people I've heard pronounce it. There's the concept of doom, and the one that I, within my studies and within my presentation of a thesis, actually saw as the largest controlling entity, and that would be Moira. Now, quite honestly, the Christian tradition does have a concept very similar to Moira. It is the idea of your lot in life. It even goes back to the biblical, where the bishopric of Judas was given to another through what? Through a casting of lot. It was, let God decide, because God has a plan, he has a path for people. And this is expressed today in ideas like your vocation. When speaking about it in religious terminology, it is what God has chosen as a path for you. But the distinction within Christianity is you don't need to take that path. It's not going to be forced upon you, and your free will can play an important part in distinguishing what is your path, what is your lot, what is your vocation, and can be significantly altered by your free choice of things like marriage or priesthood, things like that. But within the ancient Greek way of looking at it, this idea of Moira, this idea of your lot in life, was very much a constraining factor. And this is what led to the downfall of Aias. And the story of Aias is the story of a heroic individual. That is to say, someone the Greeks would see as a hero, a towering figure that was blessed by the gods. He was given this blessing in most stories because Hercules prayed that Aias' father would have a truly remarkable son. He prayed to Zeus, and Zeus granted this. And although there are different versions of the story of Aias' death, usually it's centered around the idea that Aias was such a towering figure that on the battlefield of Troy, when Ares himself, the god of war, stepped onto that battlefield to help defend the Trojan side, Aias fought with him and was able to injure a god. But the problem was that it is not within the moira of a human being to injure a god, and therefore the gods punished him for that. Now, that punishment, again, takes different forms depending on what part of the cycle you read, but it's basically they drove him insane, which then led to his death. But the important part is the fact that he was able to injure a god. Why? Because of this stepping outside of the moira that was set for him, that was set for all human beings. He was able to do something to change his fate, his destiny, his moira through this heroic, monumentally heroic actions of the individual. And to stay on the epic cycle for a minute, there is another example of this kind of thing within that story. The other one that comes to my mind is the death of Achilles. Now, Achilles had horses which were divine or partly divine, and those horses began to actually speak to lament the death of their master. And then again, the gods stepped in and struck these horses so that they became dumb, because it is not within the moira, it's not within the destiny, within the fate of horses to speak. But again, this is something that was done and able to be done because of these divine sparks within those horses and within Aias himself, coming through the blessings of Zeus. These extraordinary beings were allowed to step outside of the normal path set for them by the divine and make what is essentially a free choice, an act of the will. So this idea of the will did incubate within this Greek way of thinking, but again, it was reserved for the very special. And the change that Augustine of Hippo brought about within viewing what the free will is based on the Christian idea that there is a divine spark within everyone. That divine spark, which existed within Achilles' horses and existed within Aias, it wasn't something that was just reserved for these fantastical individuals within Christianity. It is there within every human being as the image and likeness of God. And because it is there, because each individual has this spark of the divine, each individual is able to extend that free choice, that act of the will for themselves. That act of the will is supremely important, not just for heroic individuals, but for every individual. And the 2-cent version of how it works within Augustine's expression, forgive me for going with broad strokes here, but that's what I have the time for. That divine spark, in essence, within each individual, which is a reflection of God, is the fact that God himself is expressed as love. Each individual will place his love upon something, and when you place your love upon something, you will then seek to move yourself towards that thing so that you can embrace that thing that you love. And that movement, first of placing love upon something and then moving towards it, is the, for lack of a better term, mechanical process of free will. But the important thing to note here is that each individual with this divine spark and with this free will can place their love upon whatever they choose. It is up to every individual and their free will whether they choose what is virtuous or whether they choose what is vicious. It is up to every individual to make the choice between becoming a hero and becoming a villain. And this is the backdrop to that scene in Indiana Jones and every other scene like it. Because the villain in that story, in that scene, does not believe that he actually chose his path. Or to express it in a different way, he doesn't believe that his path is a path towards villainy. It is expressed in a way where the villain says, it's the circumstances of my life that have led me to this point, which is to say, I didn't choose it. It's not me. You can't blame me. It's the circumstances. It led me to here. It is an abdication of that free will, or an attempted abdication of that free will, to say, no, I didn't choose this. This was chosen for me. And that's the heart of the conversation of Balak. He's saying, if circumstances were slightly different, you would be pushed into the darkness. But the response of Indiana Jones, the response of Luke Skywalker, the response of so many protagonists is, no, you chose wrong, and I'm not choosing wrong. So let's move on to the second question, which I asked at the first. How has this changed, specifically over the last 20 years? Because, quite honestly, I would say this is the culmination of a change that began, I could trace it back to probably William of Ockham in the late 1200s. But that change has culminated within the last 10 to 20 years in the idea that, yes, you see, the villain is right. The villain was put in this position because of the circumstances around him. It wasn't his free choice. And if you just walked a mile in his shoes, you would see that he didn't have a free choice, and therefore he's not really a villain. If you were on his side, he would be the hero. This is part and parcel of what many academics have termed the re-paganization of Western society. Why? Because we're going backwards in time to ideas not only of the Greeks and the Romans, where you had very little say in where you are going to go within life. Your free choices are really taken away because of larger forces, but it's going even deeper back into almost the prehistory of Greece, saying that, well, if you go back far enough, you have no choice. This is expressed in our society with ideas like whiteness or ideas of systemic oppression of one kind or another. There are these larger controlling forces that have forced you into a corner. You didn't have any choice in the matter. And oh, by the way, with some of these, you can't even extract yourself from them. So your free choice doesn't matter. And before I get into more of the how, by going into some statements from storytellers that I have gone over in the past within my channel, I just have to make this caveat. Some people might mistake what I'm speaking about and what I'm trying to champion the idea of as being a Nietzschean idea. That it's the triumphant act of the will that Nietzsche tried to describe within his philosophy that I am seeking to promote. But nothing could be further from the truth. As I said, I can trace this entire thing because I have degrees in political theory, which is basically study of the history or the historical and philosophical origins of ideas. And I can trace many of these ideas back to, at the very least, the 12th century, although they have been present within humanity all the time. But one of those key turning points since the late 1200s was Nietzsche himself. He was presenting an idea of the will, which was basically taking the ideas of Augustine of Hippo and simply flipping them on their head. If you look at his writings, you can see the exact phrases being used to do this. And Nietzsche was seeking also to bring back this neo-paganism by presenting an idea to people that we should go back to the Bacchic idea, Bacchus being a Greek god, of how to live. And the reason why I bring this up is because he was, however, right on one thing. He was railing against his upbringing in creating his philosophy about true manliness, and I'll put that in heavy quotes, because he thought to himself that not having a father and being raised by his mother, his sisters, and his aunts, they robbed him of all his masculinity, and he was trying to regain that masculinity within his philosophy. But he was absolutely right. They robbed him of every last ounce of masculinity, because the entire philosophy has nothing to do with the masculine at all. It is very, very much the idea of what a female thinker, and especially a confused female thinker, would think about the operation of men, would think about how men themselves operate, how men exist. So it was very much a female expression of what men were. And that's exactly what Nietzsche was doing. He was so robbed of masculinity, he was describing, erroneously, the idea of what men are by a complete female perspective, which didn't understand what true masculinity is. And I say this because this has a distinct connection to today. As I said, it was a turning point within this idea of the switch of heroism to villainy, of free will to the constraint of no free choice. Because within our society right now, we have indeed a very, very feminized society. Some of the controlling ideas that are expressed over and over again through institution after institution, certainly including the political, are the ideas, the feminist ideas of intersectionality, which, by the way, plays straight into critical race theory, as well as the ideas of toxic masculinity, which is basically a statement that everything male is toxic, everything male is wrong, everything female is correct and right. And if you look at feminist academic writings, and again, I should put that in heavy quotes, you can see that they distinguish the idea of power and empowerment. power being destructive and evil, and empowerment being creative and cooperative, power being represented by the masculine, empowerment being represented by the feminine. And one of the most notable expressions of this right now is DEI, which is short for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is based on the ideas that merit, which is competitive, is masculine and therefore evil. And so we must change the way that we hire people, elect people, deal with people based upon a feminine perspective, which is based upon emotion. Now, I'm not trying to throw too much shade upon the feminine, because movement in either the feminine or the masculine direction too much leads to an imbalanced society. There needs to be a coexistence of the two. But we have definitely gotten into that feminine side of society, and it is expressed over and over again within our storytelling. Or to put it another way, this is the worst version of how to view a female, taken to the extreme of this is the only way that females can act. And my examples of this are multitude within the history of my channel. Let's look at a video that I concentrated on that came out from Marvel.com. I did a series of videos on this podcast. Marvel.com was presenting 4 female writers as being the upcoming great writers for Marvel. And in that discussion, what did they discuss? Well, they discussed in part how each of them liked to write villains more than heroes. Why? What was the reason they gave? Well, the reason they gave was because villains, in their estimation, were much more fun to write and much more open to write because they weren't constrained by the, in their words, boxes that heroes have to act within. Now, the most prominent box in their estimation that heroes would act within is morality. But it's really much deeper than that. It's not just morality, but reality. And this brings us back, for 1 second, to that conversation between Indiana Jones and Belloc. The dynamic expressed there is that not only do you have a free choice to choose between the light and the darkness, the good and the evil, the virtuous and the vicious, but that those things, like the virtuous and the vicious, actually exist. And they exist according to what? According to reality. Because Luke Skywalker's cry of, "I'll never join you," is not just a cry of, "I'll never join the dark side," but that there is a good side and an evil side, and I will never choose the evil side. Evil exists, good exists. There is a distinct difference between the two, and I choose the good. But the cry of the villain in those scenes is, I'm not really a villain. If you look at it from my perspective, if you realize all that I have had to go through, you would see that I'm not the villain. And in more poignant stories, the villain expresses himself by saying things like, I'm the hero of my own story. What is the mentality of the villain in that situation? It's the idea that there is no objective reality that will define what is right and what is wrong. There is only what I declare to be right and wrong. So it's fundamentally the idea, actually the confrontation of the idea on the heroic side that there's right and wrong. It's defined by what is real. There is no getting around that. You can only choose between one side or the other. And the villain saying, no, everybody has their own right and wrong. Everything's relative. It's relative to the position that you are in and that you were placed in because of these large forces that control your life. It is the expression of relativity. That is the expression of the villain within older stories. And that relativity is usually focused upon an expression of emotion. Because emotion, especially in this, well, again, for lack of a better term, toxic feminine way of looking at it, has simply no constraints. And this is what those so-called future great writers for Marvel were expressing within their admiration for the villain. They're not constrained by reality, nor the expression of reality, which is morality. Which, by the way, what's the connection between those two things? The connection is that there are limitations on what human beings can do and how you can pursue your own fulfillment, your ends, which is deep fulfillment, not gratification. And this is the expression within Western civilization over and over again about disciplines of study, ideas like natural law. It's that, yes, you need to work with reality and choose what is going to fulfill you, fulfill your entire life. That's how you distinguish between what is right and wrong. and it is also the basis of the natural law statement of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But again, these writers are saying, no, you see, the villain is much more enjoyable to write because he's much freer, because he doesn't have to be constrained by morality, and I would extend that to the idea that he doesn't have to be constrained by reality. And this is also expressed within another podcast from Marvel.com that I went over, where the then second-in-command vice president of content and character development for the entire company, who was fast-tracked into that position because they wanted her to fundamentally change how comics were made, how characters were expressed, and the entire audience for comics. And these are her descriptions of what she was hired for. She was talking to Ann Nesenti, who, by the way, she is a feminist, an old school feminist, but she realized that when she was writing for Marvel in the 1980s, she realized that she was entering a male space. She realized that she had to, as a woman, alter the way that she thought about story and about conflict, because in her estimation and Nesenti's estimation, all of these stories, these superhero stories, always came down to a fight. It came down to good versus evil, and then there was a fight. And that was the central core, she says within that interview, of what comics were, and she claims what comics are. But then she was contradicted by the vice president of content and character development, Sana Amanat, who said, no, we still have the earmarks of all of that, but what the stories have become, what they are now centered around, and again, remember, she was specifically tasked with changing the center of these kinds of stories. The center of what these stories now revolve around, she says, is emotion, and quite specifically, empathy. And why empathy? Well, because, once again, if you walk a mile in this person's shoes, you will see that they're not a villain. And why? Well, because everything is relative to the situation in which they find themselves. It's got nothing to do with their free choice. It's the situation. And to show you really the extent of this, what I would call toxic feminist way of reinventing a story proceeds, to show you the fundamental basis of the mindset behind telling such stories and creating villains which aren't really portrayed as villains, I want to go back to, just for a second, a very brief description of what used to be seen within psychological terms as the unrestrained, toxic, feminine idea. Now, I say used to be because most psychology today, which I don't adhere to, would basically say, no, express your emotions no matter what, which again is an expression of this, what used to be thought of as unrestrained, toxic, feminine way of thinking. It was, as I encountered it, a faux discussion between the masculine and the feminine. And the feminine is trying to, in this conversation, convince the masculine to allow unrestrained emotions on the feminine part, and to describe how that unrestrained emotion actually works. And the masculine would say things like, okay, if you want to express your emotions, that's okay, but at the same time, you need to have some kind of consistency. If you're going to express this emotion, then to allow me to understand, stay on that emotion and continue to express that emotion unless you make a change. That is to say, unless you choose something else. And the feminine response is no, that's imposing a restrictive system on the expression of the emotions. I don't need to be consistent. I can express this emotion right now, and 2 seconds later, I can express the exact opposite emotion. Consistency is violating the expression of that emotion. And the masculine response to that, again, to bring up a secondary point, would be, okay, but you're expressing your emotions within words in X way, but your actions are expressing the exact opposite of what you just said you are feeling emotionally. Again, there needs to be some consistency. And the answer, the feminine, toxic feminine answer to that is no. Again, there needs to be no consistency between my words and my actions. That imposes, once again, restrictions upon the expression of those emotions. And when it gets down to the heart of the discussion, the male keeps expressing the fact that, okay, but what is the reason for the expression of these emotions? What is your ends in all of this? What is the point? And the toxic feminine answer to that question is, there is no point. There is no ends. There is no destination. The expression of the emotion is the thing in itself. To try and impose a point on it, again, is restricting the expression of those emotions. And how does this all play into the expression of the human experience within story? Well, we see it over and over again within current stories. Many fandoms have lamented over and over again the idea that there is no consistency. There is no sticking to the canon, the established canon of these properties. You're destroying the story. But the unrestrained expression of emotion says, no, there doesn't need to be any consistency here. That's an unwanted imposition upon the expression of these emotions. The greatest example that I covered of this was the Writers Guild of America and their presentation called Queering Legacy Characters, where they talked about continuity and how they redefined continuity not as being something objective that can be calculated according to what has happened in the past, but being a flowing river of emotion. And so you can fundamentally change every last aspect of that character and still in their minds stay within continuity because it felt right. Secondly, you have people who are looking at these newer stories and saying, these characters, their actions don't actually match their words. Their dialogue and what they do within the story are contradictory to each other. How in the world can you have that within a good story? And again, the toxic feminine expression of the story is to say, they don't need to be in connection with each other. That's a restraint upon this expression of emotion. And again, one of the things I covered within various videos that I did is podcasts, once again from Marvel.com, where they interview various editors for their Marvel books, where they openly admit that they're not allowed, and neither do they want to, actually do any kind of story editing anymore. They do copy editing, which is to say to make sure everything is spelled right, supposedly, but who am I to talk? And at the same time, they tried to present to the authors a way to express their story in a more powerful way, but they can never, and they admit this, they can never and do not wish to interfere with the telling of the story by the author themselves, because it is the author's story. It is the author putting their emotions down on the page, and you cannot interfere with that. You cannot tell them, like Jim Shooter did to Chris Claremont back when he was writing the Phoenix Saga. Chris Claremont wanted to have the entire Phoenix Saga just wiped away and have Jean Grey, the main character, go back to just being a student in Westchester, and the entire thing was reset. And Jim Shooter himself relays the story that he looked at Chris Claremont and said, no, I'm the editor-in-chief, you're not doing that. Why? Because it's a bad story. Why? Because human beings don't act that way. She just destroyed an entire planet's worth of people. You can't just reset and have her go back to being just a schoolgirl. That's not the way human beings work. That's not the way reality works. That kind of editing is no longer allowed. Again, nor do they wish to do it. Why? Because every story is an expression of the quote-unquote truth of that individual, which is to say, the expression of their feelings. Which leads into the largest, and I would say in many cases, the strongest objection to these new kinds of stories. It's, what's the point to this? If you have no continuity, if you have no consistency within the actions of any of the characters, if you have people babble on because they are unrestrained by any kind of real editing, what in the world is the purpose of this story? And again, the toxic feminine answer to that question is, there doesn't need to be a purpose. This story is an expression of the emotions of the author, and that's enough. That's all it has to be. And indeed, to place any of your constraints about what's the point upon it is to destroy, or at the very least, attempt to hamper the ability of that author to express their emotions. And a recent example of this would be the She-Hulk series that came out, and the authors specifically saying that She-Hulk was an avatar of the rage of the feminine. That is to say, in their minds, the justified rage of the female, and how that had to be expressed in an unrestrained way in order to do it justice. And again, these are the words of the writers for that series. And that unrestrained expression of emotion is a denial of reality itself. That's why, within these stories, the reality that is expressed bends and warps and twists around, usually the main character, something like a Mary Sue, because within this faux reality, because That's what stories are. They're a reflection of reality, or supposed to be a reflection of reality. Within these newer stories, these relativistic stories, that expression of quote unquote reality is that reality warps and twists and bends around the main character and how they feel, which is indeed an expression of the emotions of the author. Or to put it another way, this is the exact reason why those 4 authors for Marvel, which were considered the future great writers for Marvel, they did that podcast on, all talked about the boxes that heroes exist within. The boxes of morality and the box of reality itself. And their expression of the idea that villains were much more interesting because they were unrestrained by morality and reality. So to bring it back to that one scene from Indiana Jones, the older way of storytelling, and I'm just saying prior to, at the very least, 20 years ago, when a scene like that was played out, the hero was in the right. Indiana Jones, Luke Skywalker, multitudes of others, they were in the right in saying, no, it is my free choice because there is good and there is evil, and I will not choose what is evil, I choose what is good. You, as the villain, trying to justify your actions and your choices of what is vicious by saying everything's relative, I didn't have any choice, it was chosen for me. All of that is smoke and mirrors. You simply chose wrong. Why? Because you're attracted to the vicious, not the virtuous. Within those scenes, within that expression, the hero was seen as correct and the villain was seen as wrong. But this current way of telling a story is to flip that entire thing over on its head and to say, no, that so-called hero who's expressing black and white ideas of good and evil is actually in the wrong. That the villain is actually the hero. The villain is unrestrained by morality and by reality, and therefore can express their emotions, which is so-called the healthy thing to do. And all you need to do is walk a mile in their shoes to see that these villains are indeed the hero of these stories. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels, which concentrate on the true heroic nature. And you're looking at some of the beautiful art from those in the background. So if that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.